This week on The Futurists.
One thing the Jetsons didn't really do was tackle the whole economic side of this. You know, you don't see poverty in the Jetsons, and we assume that is sort of in a post-scarcity abundant society. And a lot of the work that George was doing was very technical related. I mean, okay, he was pushing buttons, but his company, was it Mr. Cogswell or whatever was his boss? I can't remember. But that company was working on technology for the world. And so I think, more and more companies are going to obviously have that focus. If you grew up like Rob and I did, watching cartoons on Saturdays, you probably already know the show we're going to talk about on this episode. In fact, July 31st of this year was the fictional birth date of George Jetson from the Jetsons. And we thought it'd be interesting to take a bit of a dive into what the Jetsons predicted, and what it's mean for society, what they got right, what they got wrong, and what it potentially means for society in the future, given the Jetsons was talking about a time 20 or 30 years from now, and how the Jetsons may yet still predict some of the things that we have coming. Rob, do you remember the Jetsons growing up as a kid?
Who could not remember the Jetsons? The Jetsons and the Flintstones were foundational concepts in media literacy when I was a kid. Yeah, they were on the air constantly. We were bombarded with cartoons. Those cartoons and many others, of course. But those were really, really relevant, I think, compared to some of the other things like, Looney Tunes cartoons with Bugs Bunny and Elmer Fudd and so on. For some reason, the Hanna-Barbera cartoons really resonated with our generation. And apparently they continue to resonate with people. The funny thing about the Jetsons is they only made one season. They made 22 shows. And it wasn't even considered necessarily a successful show when they produced it. So it's a little bit like Star Trek in that way. This show was introduced. It ended up having a lasting impact. But at the time, it was kind of like, just another show. One of the reasons it didn't last, or the first season was the only season that they produced initially, was because it was produced in color. And you have to go back to 1962 and realize that most households didn't have color TVs. In fact, most households didn't have color TVs until 1970. So very few people could see it in color. And that show in black and white, I imagine, would not be nearly as fun to watch. So they were very futuristic, I suppose. The two producers, Hanna-Barbera, when they produced it, they had vision about the future of television, and in a way helped bring that one to life. So, Brett, how did they arrive at 100 years? How did they arrive at George Jetson's birthday? How did they figure that out? Do you have any insight?
I don't know. I mean, I did a little bit of research before the show. I don't know why they chose that date. But you know what? It always, when I was growing up in the, like the 70s and 80s, the 2020s were the future. Right? It wasn't 2000. It was like 2020 is what we defined as the future, So
here we are
in the future.
How does it feel? You're here now.
Exactly. But I did find out something interesting. The Jetsons, of course, resided in Orbit City, it was called. There's a lot of talk about orbital cities now and so forth. We had Rosie the Robot and so forth. But the city's architecture was rendered in what we call the Googie style. Have you ever heard of this?
Yeah. That's huge. I live in LA, man. It's everywhere here.
Yes. Of course. It's not the Google style, let's be clear, it's the Googie style, but this is the style of architecture that sort of influenced the way we thought about the future in the 60s and so forth. So
everywhere you drive in LA, you see houses on stilts with the groovy signature style names on them. And the garages, the parking garages are underneath. So that idea of a house on stilts is the inspiration. I mean, I imagine that the producers would drive past houses like that all the time when they're on their way to work in LA. And they decided then to make that the theme, the visual theme for the show. It's like, just make the stilts taller, make the buildings higher.
So let's talk about some of the things they predicted that have impacted our day-to-day life these days. Of course, the most obvious one, I think, probably would be the video phone. Now, the video.
I thought you were going to say the robot, the flying car. Come on.
Well, yeah, flying cars and Rosie the Robot. We're going to definitely get into that. The sort of humanoid personification of androids, right? But if you think about the video phones, that was the majority of their communication. Now, in the 1960s, that was pretty out there. We had Dick Tracy, which was a concept earlier than the Jetsons, of course. But in the Jetsons, they took it to a new level. They had tele schooling, part of the schooling was done on video. They had flat screen TVs and they had smartwatches, which you could do video calls from as well. So all of that was fairly advanced thinking.
Yeah, in one episode, even the boy Elroy is watching the Flintstones on his wristwatch, which at the time seemed super futuristic. And today it's like, yeah, so what? Everyone can do that now.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, you mentioned Rosie the Robot. So Rosie helped the kids with the homework. Well, we do have some robots that are learning assistance robots now. I'm just trying to think of the name of the one I can't think of it right now, but I'll think of it as we go. But of course, the other aspect is Rosie did a lot of the household chores. Now, we don't have robots that walk around, but we do have robots that vacuum and mop the floors today,
Roomba.
such as Roomba.
Yeah, for sure. And people keep telling me they keep getting better and better, those Roomba robots. They were a bit of a joke a few years ago, but now it's like a real thing.
No, I think obviously as time-saving devices go, you can even get them mowing the lawn now, cleaning the pool. Right. There's variations on it. But the big thing is, obviously, vacuuming the floors, you can just leave this thing to go. It is a big time-saving device, but it was sort of that push-button society that was embedded in the whole Jetsons world.
And speaking of push buttons, that's what George did for a living. His job was to push buttons at a factory, right? So in every episode, you'll see them pushing buttons. When they want to make a meal, a little screen magically appears and they can select what meal they want to make. Or, if it's time for Elroy to go to school, the mother
3D
can select
food printers.
Then they can select the destination and those pneumatic tubes. Some of it is a bit of a joke, like the pneumatic tubes that transport people up and down instead of elevators. That was a throwback to department stores in the 1920s, 1930s that had those pneumatic tubes, but they thought it was cool. And they were like, let's bring that back for the future. That'll be the way we transport people in tubes.
Well, we could have vacuum trains like, Hyperloop and things like that. So, if you wanted to extend that concept. But I'll give you a quote from one of the episodes I watched in preparation for this from George Jetson. At work, he said, "Boy, these 3-hour days are killing me." Now, if you know his work pattern, his work consisted of an hour a day, 2 days a week. Now, this at the time, and even today, seems a little bit ridiculous, but in highly automated societies that we're going to see develop over the next 20 to 30 years, we know that artificial intelligence is going to have a massive impact on employment. So it may be that we end up working, far less hours than we do today, or having something like universal basic income because we've been replaced by artificial intelligence. What do you think?
I think this is a moment for some humility as a futurist, because futurists have been making this prediction for more than 100 years. As we automate more and more stuff in society, people will be working fewer hours. We'll have more time for leisure. We'll all be artists. You know what, Brett? Here it is in 2022. We're no closer to that vision than we were.
Working harder than ever, dude. Yeah. No, but having said that, I mean, if you look at the structural elements of employment, right now, the sort of supply and demand curve argument, this is what I wrote about in Rise of Technosocialism, is the likelihood is that, we'll replace more and more humans with AI. Anywhere there's processes that can be repetitive, you can get algorithms or robotics into there. And that means that essentially, the demand curve that we talk about in terms of meeting that from a supply perspective, we've got less and less human labor dependence there because we're using more processing cycles. But it doesn't mean we won't work. And I think, this is where the key argument comes from AI disrupting employment. People need work. They need purpose in their life. But what the UBI trials are telling us is that people start their own jobs at a much higher frequency on UBI than the general population. People get much more involved in community and social activities at a much higher rate with UBI. And don't forget, we are going to have a big, a huge demand on labor for climate mitigation in, particularly from the 2040s onwards. That's going to require a lot of human involvement. So I just think the role of work in society is going to change. Not that automation is going to be the end of work and we're all going to become artists. Although you're already an artist, so you've already got a foot up.
I'm all ready for that future. I just want the end of work part to start. The thing about the UBI, though, liberating people from dependency on work and particularly dependency on physical labor, I think that's a really promising vision, right? So you say, gosh, yeah, we can automate more and more things. Robots, robotic systems, automated systems can produce more and more parts, more and more finished products, and even transport them. So many of the physical tasks in industrial society and in advanced manufacturing are going to be automated. I think that's a safe bet. I don't think that's like a huge prediction or a gigantic leap. We can see that happening. So then the question is like, where do the humans find purpose? Where do the humans migrate to? Well, there's a great deal of opportunity for humans to invent new things. And many folks who are big bulls, big believers in this robotic future, they say, look, humans have never ceased to find new needs, to invent new wants and new desires.
Right.
And I think that's a really useful way to look at this robotic future. It's like, okay, what gifts have you got? What skills have you got to invent things that people will desire? And as there's a surplus of human labor and human imagination available, we'll probably start to do more imaginative things, I would imagine. More things that require human imagination, more novel mashups,
more creative, yeah.
Maybe more handmade stuff. As more and more things are produced and automated, that will drop in value, and the perceived value will go away as well. It won't seem so scarce or rare. So highly polished, manufactured things that almost are perfect. That's what you'll get from a robot. We'll turn to humans for wabi-sabi, that kind of like flawed artifact, the handmade, the detail that lets you know that a human being did it. And that's a great creative pursuit. So listen, if that's the future we're aiming for, where we're all potters and knitters and gardeners, I'm open to that idea. I think that could be great fun.
One thing the Jetsons didn't really do was tackle the whole economic side of this. You don't see poverty in the Jetsons, and we assume that is sort of in a post-scarcity abundant society. And a lot of the work that George was doing was very technical related. I mean, okay, he was pushing buttons, but his company, was it Mr. Cogswell or whatever? It was his boss. I can't remember. Yeah. But that company was working on technology for the world. And so I think, more and more companies are going to obviously have that focus, but it's sort of really the question of economics in highly automated societies is a good one, because if so much of society and resource allocation is highly automated, not only where do humans add value, but how does economics work when so much of what we have is just immediately available, like the food printer? As an example, or, when she was doing the grooming for the kids and things like that, her hairstyle could be changed by the machine, or the toothbrush, robot hand that came out and things like that. But all of this time saving and all of this automation, creates a society where so much of our daily needs are met by that high level of automation. What need do you have for money if all of your basic needs are catered for? If you've got a 3D food printer that can spit out food, and you've got a 3D printed home that you can live in, homelessness doesn't exist, and you've got these sensors on
not so fast.
Your healthcare and
hang on. So a closer look at the show will reveal that actually they airbrushed an awful lot out of that story. So one of the things to pay attention to when you look at old forecasts for the future, including cartoons like the Jetsons, is what's missing. What didn't they think about? What were some of the things that were happening in society right then when they were making that story that they left out or they neglected? One thing you won't see in the Jetsons is Black people or people of color.
Right.
So, this is a show that was created in 1961, 1962. There were race riots in the United States. The civil rights movement was in full swing. And just a few years later, the Civil Rights Act would be passed in the United States. So this is a very present part of American society at the time, but it was airbrushed right out of the story. And with respect to that vision of abundance, Brett, I'm sorry, but I got to chime in. I hate to be the downer here in this story, but apparently that's the way it's playing out today. So there's an episode of the Jetsons called The Spacesuit, where George's boss and their big rival competitive firm are trying to develop a flying suit. And one of them drops to the ground. Now, you never see the ground in the show. You actually see it a couple of times, but only a couple of times. But it raised a pretty interesting question. Like, well, Orbit City, where actually is Orbit City? It's in the sky.
Who lives on the ground?
Buildings are built on these, pylons or towers, or they're up they're raised up on pillars. Well, the spacesuit falls to the ground, and guess what? It lands on a homeless person. It lands on a hobo. And so it turns out that there is a guy walking around on the ground, and it's actually interesting. He's walking around like a park. It's like a green park, but he has holes in his shoes, and his clothes are ratty and torn up and so on. So he's quite clearly what we would call a homeless person today. And so the economic story that's implied there is a little darker than what you're suggesting, because what it says is that there is abundance in this world of the Jetsons, but it's abundance for the rich people who have jobs, who live in Orbit City, and then the poor people who don't have good shoes, who are homeless, they live on the ground on the planet Earth. Now, when they went back to redo the show in the 1980s, when Ted Turner's Turner Broadcasting controlled that library, they bought a Hanna-Barbera, and they brought the show back, and they made more episodes. And unfortunately, just like the modern episodes of the Looney Tunes, they're not as good as the original series. They're not as wacky. Yeah. And they started to play up this theory. They emphasized this notion a little bit in subsequent episodes, where the Earth had been spoiled, the environment was spoiled. That's why they had to live in these tower cities and sky and so forth. That's a little bit of a 1980s addition to the show. Might not have been necessary, but what they did is they underscored something that was baked into the first series, which is this notion that there are the people who have good things and they've got abundance and flying cars and they live in this great city, and there are people who do not.
And that's sort of the Elysium, vision as well. If you see that,
you got it.
Matt Damon movie, right?
That movie is the Jetsons. I mean, it's
the
like
Jetsons.
The dark perspective. It's the worm's eye view, like the person on the ground who's trying to get up to that beautiful planet in the sky, the city in the sky. That's exactly what Elysium is. Elysium is basically a high-tech version of the Jetsons.
And that's one of the flip sides potentially of UBI. If you've seen the Expanse universe, I don't know if you've ever watched the Expanse sci-fi. Mm-hmm. In the Expanse, you have two classes of people. You have those that are part of the elite class, and this is on Earth, because you have the Belters and others, people, the Martians and so forth, living outside of the Earth. But on the Earth, you have two classes of people. You have the wealthy elite and you have the basics. Those are on basic. And, so that creates a stratification of human society, because yes, you have all of your needs looked after from a basic income perspective. You don't go hungry. You have a roof over your head. You have clothes, access to, healthcare and education, but that's it. You don't have the wealth and abundance of the wealthy elite class. Those are, involved in governments or own the technologies and corporations that create like genetic engineering and AI and all of those sorts of things. And that is highly probable outcome of highly automated societies, unless we figure out a way for better wealth distribution. Because the way we think of wealth distribution today is, as the economy grows, we get better paying jobs. And so if those jobs don't exist, and we've got UBI, then that ability to have social mobility is, a problem.
Yeah,
it's interesting.
Listen, I could go deep on UBI. I'm skeptic personally. I think it's a dangerous thing for people to be dependent on a handout for their income. But it seems like people
what
are
social safety net do you have if AI takes jobs? You've got to have something. So this is a philosophical debate. This is a philosophical debate we're going to have. Let's just think about truck drivers affected by autonomous vehicles. Now, Andrew Yang has made this point, and I don't, depending on where you sit on the political spectrum. But he said, like we talk about retraining truck drivers as coders, but how realistic is that? When you look at coal miners and others who've been displaced because of changes, the reality is it's not very realistic. So
Right.
you can't just leave them to be without income. You have to provide some level of support. So depending on how large scale technology unemployment is, that's where we start talking about solutions like UBI. And of course, Zuckerberg, Musk, Mark Cuban, all of these guys, Peter Thiel, all of them talk about UBI as a fairly, logical outcome of technology-based unemployment.
Well, of course they do. Of course they do. They're billionaires. I mean, come on. This is a billionaire's approach to dealing with people who are displaced by their technology, right? They say, let's just figure out some scheme to pay those people. They haven't really put themselves in the position of a person to be on the receiving end of that. So think about the person who's receiving UBI. Where's the agency there? Where is their ability to determine their outcome? You're getting a handout every single month. Yes. It's a fixed income. That does not sound like, personally to me, like a very appealing outcome. It sounds like a scheme where they foster huge dependency on a government that hands out things. And then there's another group, as you point out, we can't get away from this notion of class. There's one class that reaps all the benefit and all the rewards. Okay, enough on that topic. Here's another thing that's missing from the Jetsons, which is an interesting thing. If you think about it, 1962, the other thing that was going on was the beginning of the Vietnam War. And the Bay of Pigs invasion in Cuba and the Cuban Missile Crisis. So we had the Cold War in full swing, and in some cases it was a shooting war. And now, of course, you wouldn't expect to see that in a children's cartoon, but there is an episode where George gets drafted by the military, and so this was kind of on the periphery. People
didn't remember that one either.
Even a kid's cartoon would be aware of this dynamic, that there were people who were being drafted and sent away to some war far away in another part of the world. What was that about?
Why didn't they have robots doing all the war?
Well, with respect to the robots, there's quite a lot. It's not just the fact that there's Rosie the Robot in the house. At one point,
the drones.
Rosie falls in love with another robot, and the robot, the superintendent of their building sends his robot away for repair, and Rosie's pining for that. And in another episode, Rosie thinks that they're going to replace her because she's kind of an old model robot. And so she's concerned that she's going to be replaced. And so she goes away. She runs away from home, a robot runaway. Now, this notion is about effective computing, computers that have emotions and computers that can sense our emotions and maybe even predict and anticipate our emotions. While that's a highfalutin way of describing a kid's cartoon, that's clearly the intent that they had with those episodes where Rosie's feeling things and understanding the way people feel. This is a huge topic in computing, and it's one of those topics that is like sort of permanent dawn, in the sense that the sun never fully rises on effective computing, where computers can discern how we feel and how we're responding. Today, when you call a call center and you're on hold for 25 minutes, or you're navigating through voicemail hell, a series of menus trying to find the person who can answer your problem, they actually have effective computing systems listening to your voice tone, and they can tell whether or not you're getting angry. So people don't realize this, but quietly and invisibly, this kind of effective computing is starting to enter our world and into our experience, unfortunately, in the worst possible way, through call centers. But nevertheless, people have that experience today. So we might not notice it. We might not be aware that there's an AI listening to us when we're on the phone on hold or calling a call center. But we are being monitored right now by effective computing. So that's another one that the Jetsons
I read a Google research article on that recently, actually. And like you said, it's the sort of emerging dawn thing. The reality is that we haven't really still cracked that, particularly in terms of facial recognition with emotions. Yeah. It turns out, you can be smiling and you can be upset. Right. There's other cues, micro expressions and things like that. Okay. I did want to get into the whole robot play in this because obviously, the way we have thought about robots in science fiction generally, an android is a very common form of robotics we see displayed in science fiction. So, of course, you had, the Forbidden Planet. You had, the robot from Lost in Space. You had
HAL 9000.
Lieutenant Commander Data. You had Metropolis. All of these movies portrayed robot or human-like robots. Now,
I see your
the
point.
word
Yes.
robot itself comes from the Czech word roboti, which comes from a play that the first use in fiction there was in 1921 with Rossum's Universal Robots.
Yeah.
Of course, that was in Czech, and they presented the robots as these electronic servants. And if you go back a bit further, you had the Steam Machine Man of the Prairies, which was 1877, I think, in terms of these penny novels that were written in the States, and this was a steam machine based man that would be able to pull carts around instead of horses. But we have got this common theme of robots being servants for us, and them being in this android form. In fact, the Czech word roboti literally means a serf, indentured servant. Right. And so this is, again, something that, we are going to, we hear talk about robots' rights and things like that. The Jetsons definitely sort of dealt with that a little bit in respect to robot personalities and so forth. But, if we do get sentient machines, which seems fairly likely, what sort of rights they have and the respect for other intelligences that we have to share the planet with, you are starting to see some awareness creep in. The fact that octopuses demonstrate forms of intelligence, that dolphins have complex speech patterns and so forth, and yet we consider them food today. So it's interesting to see how the emergence of an alternative intelligence in the form of AI might change the way we think about species that we coexist with, whether they are AI, machine-based species, or whether they're the existing species we have. It's not something Jetsons really dealt with,
So if we can create an intelligence that we consider sentient, which, by the way, some people already think we've done, they're wrong, but nevertheless, they think that we've created a sentient robot. So maybe we're on the brink. Maybe we're knocking on that door, and then what you're assuming, or you're proposing, that might cause us to value other kinds of sentient creatures, other life forms like octopuses, dolphins. We might value them even more if we're able to create it. I sure hope that's the case. I wonder if that'll be true. My big wonder is, if we create sentient robots, what are they going to think about us?
Yeah,
and why would they care about us?
Well, A, we're the creators. B, they have to coexist with us. Unless they're Skynet.
Those are two pretty big. Those are pretty big assumptions.
Yeah.
And the first thing that the robots are going to do is make better ones, right? Then they'll be the creators.
Yes.
And with respect to us, do they have to share the planet with us? We're profligate. We're wasteful. We can't manage our affairs. We create pollution. We're incredibly inefficient. We're maybe the most sophisticated biological organism on planet Earth. But I think a new form of life that's not biological in origin might look at us and say, what an inefficient process. Let's just get rid of all these things. That'll solve the problems entirely.
Well, the other thing is that when we think about robots and how they might interact with us, is we're often thinking about how super powerful humans with high order intelligence would respond. And it's, the absolute power corrupts absolutely concept. Yeah. But, we've got no guarantee that robots with, higher intelligence than us may think like humans. Of course, they could think much more differently they could be pure logic machines. They could think very differently from humans. So when we
can't
think
assume
about
they're going to be sentimental. It's a gigantic blunder to assume they're going to be sentimental about us. I think they're going to look at us with some measure of disgust.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, thanks for that upbeat assessment there, Rob.
I know, you're getting me on a day. It's like we're talking about the Jetsons.
What did you have for breakfast this morning, dude? No, it's all right.
The other thing I noticed, I was looking at the Jetsons and thinking about today's show. is how many things didn't change. How many things were in the show that were buried in the program every single week. There's an episode where they go to a football game, or George is playing golf with his boss, or there's there's a Space Cubs, which is like the Boy Scouts, where the son Elroy is there. There's car dealers and bank robbers. All this stuff seems like artifacts from a bygone era of like, oh wow, these are kind of the TV tropes.
There was no internet either. Not in the way we think of it. There was obviously automated systems, and you could select from menus for food and things like that. But and there was, but it was more TV-like in terms of the way they portrayed.
Everything was TV, and TV is a big part. TV is in every episode. TV is the central thing that the family does. We talk about this wonderful time when people won't have to work. Well, in the Jetsons, George is the only one who works. He only works 3 hours a day or 3 hours a week or something.
Exactly.
And so what do they do with all their spare time? Well, they watch a lot of television is what they do. That's one of the main things that the family does. And TV.
It's going to be the metaverse, though, by the time we're in George Jetson land.
That's right. So they spend a lot of time on TV. The Elroy wins the TV contest in one show. In another episode, both Judy, the daughter, and Elroy have a TV career, and George has to quit his job to go manage their career. And so television is a big role. The other thing I noticed in looking at it about things that never changed or changed slowly or are retrograde in that show is the role of women. And this is really extraordinary. First of all, the idea that women would have jobs in 1962 in this TV show, it was supposed to be about 100 years in the future. That idea doesn't exist. Like women don't have roles outside of the home. Even in the opening trailer, the opening credits, George is dropping everyone off at school, and then his wife Jane, he offers to give her like a $20 bill, and she takes the whole wallet. So she takes his wallet and then goes to the shopping center. And then many episodes, George is at work dreaming about when he gets home, he'll have a nice cooked meal. His wife will cook his meal and massage his feet and so on. And it's like, wait a minute, what kind of gender roles are we propagating here? For a time that's theoretically 100 years in the future. There's even beauty contests in the show, so like we have a lot of retrograde stuff.
And she gets stressed out about answering the video phone when her hair's a mess, and things like that. So it was a very 1960s view of gender roles and so forth. And of course,
in that way we can see we made a certain amount of progress.
Transgender people, or
that's right,
exactly.
That's right.
So we have made progress in that respect.
That's exactly what I'm thinking, is that society continues to move ahead in a fitful way. It starts and stops, but it does lurch ahead. And sometimes there's genuine progress that's made. You would never write a story like that today. You would never make a TV show where the gender roles are so unequal. If anything, today, you'd probably talk about how families are juggling jobs and family time and their own individual pursuits and running out of time. That would be a more accurate reflection. Probably not a fun TV show.
But that's an interesting point you make, because even right now, while we have big debate in the United States, for example, on abortion and transgender, LGBTQ movement and so forth, and it feels to some extent like we're reverting back on some of those social issues. But if you look at the broader progress humanity makes, this is the point that Brad Templeton made in that other episode we had, is that generally speaking, the stewards who look back in history at these things, they lose out, because technology also requires us to philosophically evolve as a species, and we have seen that in terms of, as you mentioned, the civil rights movement and other things. We've got more progress to make on that front, but we have made tremendous progress, which is laudable.
Yeah, I think that's worth considering. And just in terms of the gender roles, remember 1962 is the year when Marilyn Monroe sang that very famous and sultry serenade to President John Kennedy.
Mr. President.
That's right. Yeah. Just a few months before she died. And there was scandalous at the time. It was rumored that she was having an affair with the president. And so that's kind of like...
Who wasn't having an affair with JFK?
I mean, today, this stuff would be like explosive, right? You would never know. It would be intolerable, and it would be in the front page. Yeah. Back in the day, it was kind of wink, wink, nod. So that's a little bit of like a historical perspective. And I guess, you're right. It shows us that we make a kind of progress. Maybe it's lurching and uneven progress. In the United States, people today feel stagnated. They feel frustrated. career-wise, because our wages haven't gone up, real working wages haven't gone up in about 30 years. But around the world, that's not the case. And around the world, hundreds of millions of people in that 30-year interval have moved into the middle class. And that's a gigantic achievement for humanity. So it's uneven.
Especially in China.
That's exactly what I'm talking about. And India and Indonesia and other parts of South Asia, but also in Latin America. And just to put that in perspective, in 1962, when the show came out, the average income in the United States was $5,500. To buy a home, a new house cost $12,500.
Right. So it was like two and a half times your average annual salary, which is, and today it's 20 times your average annual salary. Yeah.
Right. A new car costs $3,000. You could import a car for about $1,500. A gallon of gas cost 28 cents in 1962. So,
oh my goodness.
So no wonder people weren't stressing out about income and stressing out about work and so forth. If you wrote that story today, you'd have to take into account the fact that people are struggling to make ends meet, the costs are high, income hasn't grown and so forth.
This is the great American dream. Back in those days, as long as you worked hard, you could have the white picket fence, the four bedroom home, the new car every couple of years, the dishwasher and the appliances and things like that, because the wages matched the consumption. And that was, this massive middle class growth that happened in the US. But of course, in the 1980s, late 70s and 1980s, we had both Thatcher and Reagan really put a lot of pressure on the trade union movement, collective bargaining. Then we had the deregulation of the financial services market. All of that led to, as you said, that stagnant wage growth. But in China, we haven't, we've seen that wage growth incredibly improve. They've eliminated extreme poverty over the last 20 years entirely in China. Whereas now in the US, the number of people living below the poverty line has climbed. So there's more net people in the United States in terms of pure numbers living below the poverty line today in the US than there are in Mexico. So, that's an effect of the sort of stagnant wage growth. But, that's why we're so sensitive to this inflation right now, is that margin of error, or that buffer in between salary and a healthy existence is so thin these days because of stagnant wage growth, and that's a problem of wealth distribution. And that, again, as you mentioned, this is a problem really wasn't discussed, but it was hinted at in the Jetsons, and it's something that as we get more and more automation, we're going to have to pay a lot more philosophical attention to. How do we guarantee that distribution of wealth? Because the US is the most prosperous economy the world has ever seen, which belies the question, why is it that healthcare outcomes are so poor in the country? Why don't we have, why doesn't everyone have access to, phenomenal education and so forth? You would think that the wealthiest country in the world could provide those basic core needs to the whole of society.
Well, Brett, it's a choice, right? It's a decision. Right. And as you point out, we've got 50 years of neoliberal economics, the sort of Milton Friedman school and the Chicago School of Economics that preaches extreme distribution of wealth, where you've got the great deal of wealth going to a very small number of people. That concentration of wealth upsets the balance. It also actually ultimately upsets a democracy. It makes it very difficult for a democracy to function.
Did they ever have voting? Did they ever show voting on the Jetsons?
No, they did not. No. In fact, they don't show any civil society or government, as far as I can tell. So it's interesting.
It's all automated.
They weren't issues at the time because people took that stuff for granted. It wasn't dramatically interesting. Right? Where today, if you think about a show like Game of Thrones, it's all about political struggle and kind of the bloodthirsty cut and thrust of how to get to the throne. That's the most popular TV show in history. And it's gory. It's completely violent, but it's all about a struggle for the top. It's a struggle for the crown, right? You wouldn't have told a story like that in 1962 because that just wasn't a theme. It wasn't a mainstream theme.
I think that's one thing that we need to get back to. If you think about the 60s, particularly with the space race, the atomic age and so forth, it was all about the potential of humanity. That's why Jetsons as a cartoon in many ways existed. It is because we were thinking about the potential of the future and what it could do for humanity.
That's right.
the super competitive environment, particularly post the oil crisis years, in the 70s, has produced this heightened view of competition. We compete on an individual level for salary. We can compete company versus company for clients, for revenue, for market share. We compete nation against nation for global trade and so forth. But in the 60s, it was really about competing for humanity, for the future of humanity.
Yeah.
And yes, there was still competition, but it was secondary to advancing the human species.
Well,
and
the
I think
competition that we had at the time was the Cold War, right? So there was the communist system, which was expanding. Let's not forget, in the 1960s,
the Marxist-Leninist way, yes.
They were on a path to global revolution, right? All the colonial countries in Africa, for instance, and in Latin America were subject to infiltration and manipulation by Soviets. So you had that as a threat. And actually, we don't talk about this much. And in the United States, we're not supposed to talk about it, I guess. But the United States was a lot more fair to workers when the Soviet Union existed. And as soon as the Soviet Union went out of existence in 1990, when the Cold War ended, lo and behold, we have this surge of inequality, and suddenly workers are being treated poorly. Why is that the case? Gee, let's think about that for a second. So there was a real competition of ideas, and it was lively in the 1960s. But the competition of ideas was between Western-style capitalism and Soviet-style socialism, right, or communism, if you will. And that competition of ideas forced governments around the world to think about fairness and equality and treating labor right, making things accessible, making education accessible. Don't forget, in the Kennedy years, they opened up a whole bunch of colleges, trade schools.
Right.
The idea was to educate workers, and the government invested resources. The government it wasn't run on the same basis that we run the government today, this kind of like economic measurement of ROI and every single decision, a very short-term perspective. Instead, they were focused on the long-term values. We
heard a lot more talk about the American way of life as a defense against the communist movement.
And everybody in the country could unify around that.
Right. But today we don't hear talk about the way of life. We hear about making America great again, but the focus isn't on producing a way of life that everyone's comfortable with necessarily. It's getting back to traditional values, when in fact, that way of life, that everybody could prosper, that everybody could be prosperous, have a new car every few years, have a roof over their head, have the roast dinner every Sunday, the TV where they could have that leisure time and entertainment, and the kids could be out playing sports on the weekend and so forth. That way of life that was really valued, we've lost a lot of that. And that's something that I think, if we are going to have highly technical societies like the Jetsons, it's got to be based on bringing that sort of quality of life to every corner of humanity, rather than, just a select few who own the assets and the wealth, that power the future of, highly autonomous societies.
What a manifesto. What a high note. And
what thought do you think we should leave it on, apart from that?
I like that vision you just shared with us.
All right, then,
I like that vision just fine. No, listen, it's a stirring vision, right? We took a fairly trivial topic today, a cartoon show that was about 100 years in the future, that's now aging, and it is definitely showing its age. With all of its built-in biases and all the people in the story who are erased out of the narrative. So some of that stuff did not age well. Some of the technological forecasts, well, those were pretty spot on. Some were not. Yeah. But as you can see, these narratives that we tell ourselves can have a profound impact. And sometimes they're a reflection of the society around them. And so for people who are listening today, I think let's take that away from it. Say like, gee, what stories are we telling ourselves today about the world we live in the future that we're about to build? Where's the vision of progress? And is it a vision of shared progress? Is that an equal vision of progress? So I like the note you just shared with us. I think that's a powerful manifesto.
Well, if you like this episode, you know what to do. You can go and give us a 5-star rating on iTunes. You can tweet us out. Rob and I, we don't do this type of episode every week. Let us know what you think. Would you like us to have more discussions on the future like this? Of course, we can bring guests in. Obviously, we focus on the futurists that are building the world of tomorrow, but sometimes it's good to get into the weeds and talk about whether the future is going to be good or bad and how we're going to get to a future that's desirable and positive for everybody. So that's what we thought we'd do with the Jetsons today. Let us know what you think about it. Don't forget to, as I say, leave us a review. And thanks to our production team, to Kevin Hirschen, to Lisbeth Severance, Sylvie and Carlo, who help us put the show together each week. And thank you all for listening as well. We really enjoy being on this show, Robert and I, and we enjoy the fact that you guys find it intriguing and interesting as well. But you know what we're going to say next, right? We'll be back next week. We will see you
in the future.
In the future.
Well, that's it for the Futurists this week. If you like the show, we sure hope you did. Please subscribe and share it with the people in your community. And don't forget to leave us a 5-star review. That really helps other people find the show. And you can ping us anytime on Instagram and Twitter at Futurist Podcast for the folks that you'd like to see on the show or the questions that you'd like us to ask. Thanks for joining. And as always, we'll see you in the future.